Yeah.
Yeah.
That's what the.
Guantanamo.
Hold on.
revolution, against the criminal U.S. blockade that has had such a devastating impact on the Cuban economy. It's also meant to be, in addition to being direct action about anti-imperial solidarity, it's also a direct action about how people should have the freedom to move across borders, regardless of any desires of the imperialists or the bourgeois. So yeah, it's all around a trip about solidarity, a trip about learning, a trip about building with Cuba and Cubans and learning from the Cuban Revolution. So yeah, that's what I was doing, 2 weeks. And I believe that African revolutionaries in particular should travel to Cuba because first and foremost, Cuba has a long and extremely principled history of solidarity with our struggle for liberation on the continent and in the diaspora. They have, of course, the Brigadistas out of Shakur. They sent soldiers, weapons, funding, training, doctors to anti-colonial struggles all over the continent and all over the diaspora, including in Guinea-Bissau, including in Mozambique, including in Tanzania, also in Grenada, also in Haiti. They also tried to send aid to Africans living in the United States. After Katrina, when the U.S. government abandoned them under Bush, and the Bush government refused Cuba's aid, and so Cuba basically has had a long history of moving in solidarity with the struggles of African people. And they do this not because they want access to our sweet resources or because they're just not able to exploit our labor as African people, but because they understand that our liberation and the liberation of Africa is tied up with their liberation. They understand that the liberation of Africa and the liberation of African people contributes to the struggle for global justice, and so they see it as part and parcel of their struggle for liberation. So Cuba represents a nation that engaged in an act of collective resistance and engaged in our struggle to overthrow capitalism and colonialism on their territory, and then once they had won that armed struggle, they weren't just like, okay, and we're good, peace. They decided they were going to share what they had learned and share the meager resources they had as a poor global South country with struggling people all over the world, including African people. Cuba is a model of international solidarity, and just to be in a space where people are so committed to justice that they will travel across the ocean, that they will send their children, that they will send their resources to assist other struggling peoples, like a place with that strong sense of justice and collective self-determination is extremely inspiring. In addition to that, Cuba is from the future, meaning that Cuba has discovered a way to organize its society around the basic needs of its people, around meeting the material conditions or the material needs of its people that need to survive. So rather than a society we have in the United States, where it's organized for profit, where like a few sociopathic people of all identities control all the resources while the rest of the people there starve, Cuba has organized a society in such a way that the resources of this, once again, poor global South country are distributed equally among the people to make sure everybody has healthcare, has housing, has high quality education, has food, has what they need to live and survive and self-determine and organize collectively for power. So it's just really incredible to see a society that's basically organized in the opposite manner from the capitalist or the United States, that's organized around the needs of the masses of the people, that's organized to make sure that the weakest person, the most vulnerable person, has their needs as met as the strongest person or the most productive person. It's just, again, incredibly inspiring. It's the world that we are trying to build. Those of us who are socialist revolutionaries or anti-capitalist revolutionaries in the United States, we have not yet built that, but we have an example very close by that we can learn from. And that is under constant attack from the United States. And that's the last reason I want to touch upon, is that we are citizens of a country which is a force for evil throughout the world. The United States squashes the national liberation aspirations, the freedom aspirations, the colonized and oppressed peoples all over the world for no other reason than to make sure they have access to exploitable labor and cheap resources to fuel the capitalist machine. If we are people living in the United States, we benefit as first world citizens from that exploitation, from that order. And so it is our responsibility as people living and fighting in the belly of the beast to move in solidarity with other struggling peoples, just the way Cuba has. Cuba's poor as hell. Cuba is under constant attack from the United States, but Cuba still maintains their commitment to international solidarity because they understand it's one struggle with many fronts. And so we, as citizens of a country that is currently attacking Cuba, a model for revolution, a model for socialism actively, we have a responsibility to Cuba and to all oppressed peoples to stand against that, to move against that, to move in solidarity with struggling peoples internationally. So yeah, learn from Cuba, go to Cuba, discover how African Cuba is. I couldn't even touch on that because I wanted to keep this video short. And Cuba is from the future. Cuba is African and indigenous. Cuba is an example to learn from, and Cuba is a model to move in solidarity with. Thank you.
Wow! Viva!
Yeah. Okay. Thank you, Oni, for that awesome video. Every single time I watch it, it just inspires me, and I hope it inspired everybody else. But before we get started, we would like to continue a practice that we've been, very adamant about educating other people on, and that's giving proper land acknowledgement. This land that we're on currently, known as Albuquerque, is actually the ancestral homelands to my people, the Tijuan-speaking people of Sandia and Isla del Pueblo, before colonization, before first contact. These lands were thriving with 13 smaller pueblos that all spoke the Tiwa language. And I want to also just pay homage to the revolution that began in this area as well. The first standoff against Spanish colonizers was in 15 years, stood up against muskets and other types of metals with the resources that we had here for about 80 days. And the reason why we had to surrender was the lack of water. Otherwise, I'm sure my people would have kept going. And then also, this is a place where the Pueblo Revolt of 1860 began, and it's never ended. And we're here to talk about how we can uplift all of other different revolutions, including our own here. So, thank you.
Julia was trying to get me to do the land acknowledgements. And I said, only if you sing the Lakota national anthem. It's quite an honor to be asked by SWAP, by AAPRP, by PAA to be a moderator for this panel. And I think it really shows and demonstrates the kind of solidarity that exists here just within this small space of the so-called United States, which is Tewa land, and it will always be Tewa land. But also, I think it speaks to the kind of internationalism that our organizations aspire to and are committed to. So for example, I wasn't in Cuba, but I was also in Cuba in some ways because I was on an international delegation with the Red Nation in Venezuela. And there were actually Cubans there. And it was part of the first meeting of original people in the Western Hemisphere as part of a long series of encounters or meetings, international meetings that are headed by the Bolivarian Revolution. It's not a pink tide. I think when anyone says that, I remember I was sitting in a commune and an African brother said, and I said that word, and I said it in a question, but because of the language translation, he heard it, he immediately responded back. He said, this is not a pink tide, this is not a progressive social movement. He said, this is a revolution. To say that this is a pink tide is an insult, is what he told me. And I remember that. He's like, only gringos say pink tide. So I just want to just kind of put some context into this talk tonight, and then I'll introduce the panelists and turn it over to them. I think Bolivia is weighing on our minds right now. And one thing that hasn't been really brought to the mainstream media or even to the attention of social movements, this video, and our comrade was speaking during, talked about the international aid of Cuban doctors and the Cuban healthcare system. 700 Cuban doctors were expelled from Bolivia. They were expelled from communities that don't have access to running water or electricity. They were expelled from communities that are already under siege and are currently more under siege because of the white supremacist, fascist-backed Christian government under Yanin Áñez. And so Cuba is also in Bolivia as well. And when I was, during my visit to Venezuela, I saw one of the Chavista hats with the flag, the tricolor and everything and the stars on it. And I was looking at it, and it was really fascinating because it had a picture of Fidel, it had a picture of Che Guevara, it had a picture of Hugo Chavez, and it had Evo Morales. And all of them were the same shade color. They were all really, really brown. And I was thinking about that because as Christ, right, has crossed the Atlantic into our homelands as indigenous people, he became blonde-haired, blue-eyed. He was no longer a Middle Eastern man, right? But as the Bolivarian Revolution has progressed, and as these revolutions have progressed, beginning with, I would say, the 20th century in the Americas, and really, solidly housed and centered in Cuba, there has been a process of indigenizing, of Africanizing, of darkening the revolutionary traditions. And I would say that Cuba is not a model Soviet state. It is a model indigenous socialist state in this hemisphere. And it's important to remember that. Why is it that Che Guevara, as soon as he crosses that border, becomes a white guy, He was an African because he fought for African revolution and African liberation. He was Bolivian because he died in Bolivia, right? And so I think it's important to remember that these are movement towards socialism, but there are certain kind of socialism. And as Chavez often said, he said, the two revolutionary traditions that run through my blood are the kind of socialism that we want in Nuestra America, all of America, not just the Americans of American exceptionalism, but it's African revolution, African slave revolts, and indigenous resistance. And so without further ado, I'm going to introduce Julia Burnell, who's the Environmental Justice Director of Pueblo Action Alliance. She conducts the policy analysis on a federal and tribal and state level to better educate Pueblo indigenous communities on the environmental issues that are most important to Pueblo communities. She has a bachelor's in English from the University of Redlands and is currently working on her 2 Masters of Arts in water resources, policy management, and community and regional planning, focusing on New Mexico water governance and radical water management strategies. She's also the board of directors for the Native American Voters Alliance Education Project and serves as the All Pueblo Council of Governors Natural Resource Committee. She is from the Sandia and Taos Pueblos and the Yuchi Creek Nation of Oklahoma, and she happily lives in the Sandia Pueblo with her 2 dogs. Summer is an African woman marooned in the United States resisting colonialism and capitalism. She's a cadre member of All African Revolutionary Party and the All African Women's Revolutionary Union, also writes for Good Communist. You should read it, it's cool. And she's also been featured on several podcasts, and you should check out Anticonquista as well. Roberto Roybal was born and raised in Santa Fe and has lived in Albuquerque for the last 50 years. He's worked with the Southwest Organizing Project for the last 28 years. He began working with the New Mexico Regional Committee in the Venceremos Brigade in 1977. He went to the international students in Cuba in 1978. He has gone to Cuba with the Venceremos Brigade about 20 times and went on the 50th anniversary contingent to Cuba this year. And last but not least, Sheldon Tenorio from Kewa Pueblo uses music as a tool to help others find voice and express themselves in a healthy, creative, and positive way, shedding light on the power of returning to ourselves, looking within, and how we can heal and reclaim our identities. He believes this can be accomplished through creative writing, poetry, spoken word, and hip-hop, furthering this healing and in turn strengthening ourselves first, then our peers, families, and communities, ultimately the people. Sheldon has great experience in direct action training and youth development through the arts. Sheldon also works with the Cuba forestry crew and has been in the field of conservation for over 10 years. Sheldon joined Public Action Alliance after meeting a member at the 7th Generation Fund for Indigenous Peoples Keeping and Home Fires Burning Conference in November of 2017. So, give it up. Yeah, so I'll ask the first question. I guess the question that I have, and I was just kind of, I've been thinking about it when we were just sitting outside, is what is the kind of representation on these brigades, and why, or what is the kind of perspective that Indigenous and African peoples bring, but also what did you take away from this particular experience as African and Indigenous people?
Okay, for me, I was on my first brigade in 1979 on the 11th contingent, and this year on the 50th anniversary contingent, we had about 180 people from the United States go down, and this was by far and large the most diverse group that the Venceremos Brigade has ever sent to Cuba, which is really gratifying because like people are saying, in Cuba, it's totally indigenous, African mixture of folks. And so we want to be able to have that type of diversity on the groups we send to Cuba from the United States. Because for me, it's important that people of color go to Cuba, come back to our communities, and share this information. And what we say is, stop the lies against Cuba, stop the blockade. This blockade against Cuba by the United States, by international standards, is an act of genocide. And that's the main reason I go to Cuba, to learn more. It inspires me from day to day. It's a model of what I want to see in this country, for it's people before profits.
Cool. Yeah, so I had learned about Cuba as a member of the African People's Revolutionary Party. We learned all about the history of internationalism. We learned all about the national liberation struggles in the southern part of Africa that Cuba sent assistance to. So before I'd even heard about the Venceremos Brigade, I had a deep respect for Cuba. Like, I wanted to understand why it is a country would fight so hard to be free and then be so committed to life, to the furtherance of life and the better good, that they would sacrifice tremendously to send troops across the world, to send their family members across the world to help folks, and not even knowing if they would ever see them again. So going into it, I knew that I swear a lot, so I might pause to not swear. Going into it, I knew about that history. I had a deep respect for Cuba, and I just wanted to see what kind of society is this that produces this kind of action. And just going there, and it's interesting because on the top level, there's it's a place colonized by Spain. If you've been to any place in the Caribbean or Central America, you see there's a lot of veneration of Spanish history, even though Spain is the colonizer. And that was definitely happening in Cuba. And I was like, what the hell? You fought a war against them. Why do you care about this? But as I got deeper and I started talking to people, and the majority of people that I saw and spoke to were African people, Indigenous people. So as I started to learn about their experiences and talk to them, it became really clear to me that Cuban culture itself was extremely African and extremely Indigenous. Even their relationship to resources and to land and to each other, where it's about collective good and about reciprocity and mutual care rather than dominance over or exploitation. Even that's not European, that's not Western, that's African and Indigenous. So there's that veneration of Spanish culture on top, but there's that history and that culture and that influence of African and Indigenous peoples and struggles that made the revolution possible and that informs Cuba's history today. So it's really exciting to see that, and really exciting to see that this force for good and this great victory for justice came from African and Indigenous peoples. It gave me a lot of pride.
I think to answer the question, I'm gonna share a story of when I was out there one of the first mornings. We got to go out and help in the different gardens, different crops. The day we went out, we were able to go and harvest beans that we later had for dinner that evening. When I was out there, I barely got by thanks to the relatives here being able to translate. But during that walk we had, taking the beans, the green beans back to the kitchen, it was funny because we were able to connect in a way beyond words, you know, in a way to transcend languages, in a way to transcend territories, much like how our ancestors used to move, and much like how our ancestors used to share with other nations. You know, that's what I was reminded of. And it was crazy because out there, when we were walking, we were saying things, we were pointing at different, at the sunrise, we were pointing at the land. I was really amazed at how red the dirt was and how moist the soil was. And you know, it's really amazing because at home it's super dry. And it's like, wow, you know, this is amazing soil. And just being able to like laugh and joke and look at each other and understand that like we were talking about the land. We were talking about the connection between raising crops or tending to the land and cultivating the land. And we were able to like laugh and joke and like look at each other and just kind of understand that, oh, this is what we're talking about, even though I'm speaking English right now and you're speaking Spanish, and we're even laughing at the fact that that's what we're doing, but we can understand each other. So I think just for me, you know, like the perspective that as an indigenous person, as a Cuban person was carrying with me was trying to be open-minded, but also looking through the lens of what I was taught at home, and then seeing that there and how healthy that is there. You know, not just the soil and the land, how healthy that is, but the culture and the people, and in connection with each other, with the land, the communities, and everything that is that they continue to defend to this day.
Thank you. So, as Nick had mentioned, I do a lot of environmental justice work and Native liberation work here in my territory. I've been very dedicated in tackling and educating myself on the issues here. And I think one thing that was missing in my own like discovery and education was learning about other movements in other places. And so, you know, having all of these other relationships with like SWAP has really opened up other opportunities to learn from other cultures and other land bases, which is how we got involved with the VB this past year. And I couldn't be more thankful because it really opened my eyes in terms of there's literally another place, an island off of the Caribbean, that is like one big Indian reservation. I had never felt more safe and at home than when I was in Cuba. Like the video was saying, it's a culture that is for humanity. Words like grassroots, bottom up organizing, humanity, revolution. I had never heard those words being spoken and repeated over and over again the 3 weeks that I was there. And I've lived here in the US my entire life. And so, you know, that was just a more personal journey that I experienced on this brigade. But in terms of representation, I think it's fair to say that a lot of these like political educational exchange have to be funded, right, by money. And so a lot of the times marginalized communities or, you know, Black and brown, indigenous and African communities may not have those resources to actually go on experiences like that. So I had been hearing, you know, in the past of the brigade that the representation of indigenous people from Turtle Island has been very sparse. And so that's why like we're here to share what we learned, what we experienced, so that way we can change that. Cuban people, that our revolution as indigenous people has never ended, and we just need that fire to be lit again. And I think we all have that within us, and every single time I see pictures or talk about Cuba, I always feel like that revolutionary essence that is just everywhere in everything that exists like on the island.
Yeah, it does feel like Roberto. Yeah, it does feel like Roberto's point to what Julie was saying about how colonized people in Cuba, particularly like living in the middle of the United States, it can feel like we could never win. Like we're up against a beast and there's nothing we can do. And so going to a place where people like us did win is like, and then like they won and then they kept winning for 60 years. And the United States the entire time was attacking them and they were just like, they just like done with it. So it's really incredible, really inspiring. It's really important for college people in particular to have that example because we have to believe we can win, otherwise we're not going to survive here.
Yeah, if anyone, I don't know, like every time I come back to the United States after traveling abroad, it's like getting punched in the face. There's one thing that if you've been following the news recently and even looking at like WikiLeaks cables from the US embassies in Venezuela and Bolivia, you can tell just by piecing together even State Department memos and press releases that they believe that the sanctioning and the overthrow of the Bolivarian government, the Bolivarian Revolution in Venezuela is the backdoor to Cuba. And so we can't think of the Juan Guaidos or the Yanin Añezes of the world as kind of like anomalies, but we actually have to think of them, or the Jair Bolsonaros, as part of this kind of global right-wing fascist, old school like Hitler fascist, but neo-fascist kind of movement that's meant to not just single out Cuba, but to push back this wave of revolution. And so the next question is, and Roberto began to answer this, is why is the United States blockading Cuba?
Okay, back to 1959. After decades and decades and a century of oppression from first Spain and then the United States, the Cubans were totally colonized. I mean, if you look at the old history books, and of course I remember that growing up in the 50s, but Cuba was like a playground for the wealthy elite in the United States. They had the casinos, the gangs, all this kind of stuff going to Cuba. And we literally ran everything there, from the sugar plantations to everything. The U.S. controlled it. So with the Batista dictatorship, the Cubans finally got sick and tired of, and they'd been struggling for decades and decades and decades against the different dictatorships in Cuba. So finally, with the going to the Granma province again this year and seeing where the Granma boat landed with 80 Cuban revolutionaries that had come from Mexico to start the armed struggle against the dictatorship. It took them that many years, and they finally became victorious on January 1st, 1959. That's the birthday of the Cuban Revolution. And in 1960, Cuba declared its socialist nature. Internationally, they declared that. And from day one, from January 1st, 1959, Cuba has been a target of by the United States to overthrow the Cuban Revolution. And I mean, there's been like literally hundreds of attacks, assassination attacks against President Fidel Castro. We had the Bay of Pigs invasion against Cuba. It was an armed struggle. The U.S. invaded with their proxy gusanos, what they call the worms, the people that left Cuba, the wealthy elite that left. They had an armed attack. The Cubans mobilized and turned back the armed attack by the United States and overthrew that. And so, like we're saying, it's been just surviving from day to day. And I could just go on that, so I just want to pass it on to let people take up some other ideas.
So one important thing about Cuba for the revolution, and this is why when people talk to me about how Castro was a dictator and he made it worse, I'm always like, get out of my face. Because before the Cuban Revolution, Cuba was Jim Crow segregated, meaning that people that looked like me were not allowed to go in most places of the island. They were the help, they were oppressed, they were exploited. And the Cuban Revolution ended that condition.
The condition of African people in Cuba drastically improved upon the Cuban Revolution. So when people try to tell me it was better before, I'm like, you're probably just really racist. But if the example of the Cuban Revolution and the stated purpose of the the blockade against Cuba, according to the U.S. government, is to make the Cuban people suffer so much that they overthrow the government. That's the intent. That's like what they wrote down and said why we're doing this. They want the Cuban people to suffer so much that their conditions become unbearable and they overthrow the Cuban government. Obviously, that has not happened. And going to Cuba, after hearing my whole life it was a dictatorship, and seeing like not one police officer, not one security camera, feeling comfortable in my skin and like I wasn't going to get profiled or accosted, I was like, this is clearly a much greater place than the United States. And that's the reason they don't want people to go. They don't want to see for themselves what it's actually like. They don't want people to see that a social society is like way, way, way better on every level. They have to destroy socialism ideologically and then to destroy socialism militarily because socialism would take their power. That is the purpose of the blockade, is to destroy the example. But the idea that the Cuban people are going to suffer so badly they're overthrow the government is a farce because they're happy. Because the conditions that they have in their society, the collectivism, the meeting of the basic material needs of the weakest, that is something they built together. That is something they fought for and won and then created collectively amongst themselves. They're never going to give that up. It's not about Castro, it's not about Che. Like, we respect them, we admire them, but they would not have succeeded in the least without the masses of the Cuban people. And the masses of the Cuban people are going to defend their revolution. The blockade is never going to work. It's just making people suffer unnecessarily.
It's always a task following Oni. No, I'm just kidding. No, but I mean, it's an interesting question. Like, why is the U.S. basically blocking resources to Cuba, and also like other ways of trade and exchange, so that way the Cuban Communist Party and the Cuban nation can achieve their ultimate goal, which is to be a communist state. And it's all, I think it's all based on like this, on ideology, you know? There is empathy that is completely missing from any sort of type of governmental structure in the US. And to me, going to Cuba and seeing that and it function well, and it actually makes for things to be a lot more simple, you know? It's really bottom-up organizing. You have the CDRs, then you have like the municipalities, right? And then you have the provinces, and then you have the state. And it's all voted on, they're all locally elected, everybody trusts their leaders and appoints their leaders, and then political leaders who are voted into positions of power are volunteers, therefore they're not making a profit off of serving their communities. And so why would a country block a philosophy that just makes sense for humanity? And the only answer I can really come up with is money. I mean, it's all about money, and we see the perfect example here in the US. Like, there are very, very rich people, and there's so many much more poor people. And there's just this class divide that happens here. And I mean, it all comes down to money, really.
So yeah, those are really important points, and I think like even this accusation of Fidel being a dictator it's really important to put this into like a historical context, that this, like the Cuban Revolution was in many ways, like as what was said previously, it was attempted to be overthrown on multiple occasions, and Fidel understood what that meant, but also the Cuban people understood what that meant. And so, like if we look, I mean, just going back to recent or sort of more contemporary examples, such as Venezuela and Bolivia, we understand what happens when you do put somebody like Evo Morales into power, or you do vote somebody like Nicolas Maduro into power, that if you vote a cocalero or a bus driver into power, what do you get? So I think that's important to remember, and also to think of, Julia mentioned that the conception of the state is much different. There's an idea of not the state is kind of alienated from me, it's state and individual, or state and society, but we are the state. And so I think that's important to point out. The question that I have kind of to follow up on the blockade is, how is the blockade affecting Cuba? And maybe talk about it being an act of genocide. Everyone has kind of said that. And even thinking about what constitutes genocide in the UN Declaration on Genocide. But then also, how, another question would be, how is that blockade affecting the United States in turn?
Yes, I'm ready for this question. So, as mentioned earlier, the healthcare system in Cuba is absolutely amazing. When we were there, we had the opportunity to meet. There was a picture up here, and I'll start with that. That picture was in Camagüey, and it was at the Children's Hospital. And I was a little nervous at first because I'm so used to just hospitals here in the U.S. and they're sad. They're really sad here, and so the nerves were kind of coming in, and we were talking with the doctors, and we were asking about. People were asking certain questions, and one of my questions to them was, and relating it back to indigenous struggles here in the U.S., is that we, what is their type of approach in mental health? Here in the U.S., indigenous youth have an epidemic, which is suicide and mental health. And what I asked was, is that something that you see often, or is that something that you deal with? And the doctor I could tell he was really sad. He was like, I know what you're talking about, but that doesn't happen here. That doesn't happen here, and it's because of our society. Our society here cares about our children. Everybody has the right to vaccination. Everybody has the right to health care without a cost. Those are all subsidized by the state. And so when we were touring through the rooms, or through the halls and the other buildings in this, it was a really beautiful hospital, actually. One thing that really struck me was that there wasn't just a bed for their patient, but there was also a bed for a family member, and we don't see that in the U.S. at all. So just, making this process for the family a lot easier, having, food available, and just being more interactive. The doctors knew all of their patients by name and were kissing their patients on the forehead, and I think that we as the U.S. are suffering from the blockade because Cuban healthcare and biotechnology and other types of research that is in Cuba could just change our healthcare system here in the U.S. They were talking about those who experience diabetes. They've never amputated a limb because of their biotechnology and how they treat people. They don't treat people as profit, but they treat them as actual patients. And there's something to that I think if we're gonna start, as indigenous sovereign nations, start building solidarity with other states, I think Cuba would be the best one. I think if we were able to get Cuban healthcare research and resources into the communities that are suffering from things like diabetes, which is indigenous and African and Chicano people, that would completely change our well-being. And then just also, like in the video earlier, talking about being in solidarity with African people, because the liberation of African indigenous people, it means the liberation for all, is that Cuba spends a lot of their resources developing ways in which they can combat starvation in African countries. And they don't do this by sending bread and rice. They do this by engineering natural organic vitamins that will actually help with starvation rather than just feeding people. You know, there's a difference between helping a person become well and then just giving them a piece of bread so that they're not hungry anymore.
Yeah, just to add on to what Julia was saying, you know, like, think of like how they treat, you know, we have like commods or like MREs or commodities and things of that sort, you know, to just give out instead of like giving you something that's gonna help, like Julia said, your well-being and get you healthier and get you better. It's just something to like keep you there, kind of just give you rations or give you, you know, the crumbs off the table kind of thing. And something that I was reminded of was just like the compassion that comes from these, everybody, you know, the biotechnology fields, like the doctors and people who are doing this research. And one thing that I heard when I was out there, and it's always stuck with me, they were saying the blockade isn't hurting Cuba, the blockade is hurting people in the US. You know, and I immediately thought about our relatives at home, like going who have diabetes, who have lost limbs, who have, you know, either, you know, passed away or like, you know, like you think about these things and you feel it. Like, again, a lot of it for me was just like feeling through it and like listening to folks and really just like going through it and hearing different stories. And it made me think of this too. Me and Julia had a conversation after we were headed to a different community on the bus. We were talking about how this could be a real possibility, and how, in a way, for me, I was understanding this, how we could take the knowledge that we have as indigenous peoples, with the medicines that we have, how we live off of the land, and what we used to, what we still use today, what I use today too when I'm sick or I'm going through something, immediately at home and have natural remedies to go through it instead of going through the like big pharma or pharmaceuticals or these pills that constantly just like make you spend money and people are making profits off of, you know, thinking back about the natural remedies and all of these medicines that we do have, you know, being able to be in Cuba and see that it was a way to like see how this can come together, how this could be bridged together in a way where it then becomes something greater for the greater good, for the people, for humanity, and like all of us, you know, instead of just profit or sick.
I really need to add one more thing on healthcare because this is really important. So in Cuba, because of the blockade, they have limited resources in terms of energy. So the island itself doesn't produce much oil and gas to, you know, for electricity, for cars and buses and things like that, right? So that is something that is affecting the research that goes into like a lot of the healthcare and medical field. For example, we learned that a lot of these research centers, because of the lack of, you know, oil and gas to power lights and air conditioning and what have you, are literally doing research in the hottest, most humid weather without air conditioning on. That is how dedicated they are into coming up with solutions to, you know, for better well-being. And another thing I wanted to add quickly is that Cuba also wants to educate or to put American students through medical school free of charge. They want to send our people to medical school free of charge, and the only thing that they ask for is that they go back to their communities and that they help them. You know, that's all they want. And you know, so that's part of like the solidarity building, and not just solidarity. I like to think of it more as, you know, partnership and camaraderie, because, you know, we're gonna start working together to see if we can actually, you know, send somebody from a Black or brown community to complete medical school completely free, and that can only just better our communities as well.
Yeah, and like all of these advances in medical research and in biotechnology are happening against the backdrop of a devastating blockade that has stolen hundreds of trillions of dollars for Cuba's economy over the course of 60 years. That you can see the impacts every day. Like while we were there, they had a shortage of milk and they couldn't get garlic. So like we were fed for free 3 times a day with snacks, and they like gave that to us and prepared for us, cooked for us. But they were making a tremendous sacrifice because they can't get basic things. And so the food itself was like pretty basic. I liked it. It's like how my mom cooks. But it was like, you know, people were like, I thought it was gonna be fancy. And I'm like, no, they can't get garlic. They can't get like citrus products because they don't grow there because they can't import them from outside. The other thing that we came across was that one of the members of ICAP, which is the Cuban Institute of Friendship with the Peoples, was talking about how the power was off in their neighborhood. And it had been out for a couple of days. And that was because Venezuela, which is like an oil-rich country, was sending subsidized oil to Cuba, and the US intercepted the ship and turned it away. And so because they couldn't get oil, because it's an island, if it doesn't come on a ship, they're not gonna get it, they couldn't turn their lights on, they couldn't run the generators. And so like things like that, like devastating impacts on day-to-day life, where like people can't go to work because they can't have lights or electricity, like that is the impact of the blockade day to day. And so like on the news in the United States, when you hear about Cuba, it's usually about how Cuban people are suffering, but they never talk about the fact that the US is doing this intentionally. It's an intentional policy that's 6 decades old. They're stealing all this money, they are forcing people to flee to survive. It's an intentional act. Cuba's not suffering because Cuba wants to suffer, Cuba is suffering because the US is attacking it.
Okay, talking about the blockade, it has been very vicious, like I said, from the armed invasion in 1963 with the Bay of Pigs, and ever since. So Cuba was getting a lot of support from the socialist blocs around the world, particularly from the Soviet Union. But with the fall of the Soviet Union, they went into what they call the special period. So for me, going to Cuba in the last 30-some, 40 years, I've seen some of these trends. Like at one time, back in the early 80s, you know, the folks were very healthy, a little bit robust, maybe 2 pounds, because they were doing really well, eating a little too much probably. But then after the special period, I remember going after 1990, and the Cubans were having to ride bicycles all over the place, ride horses, carts, and the population lost a lot of weight. And so it's gone up and down just like that kind of superfluous stuff. But blockade, there was the Helms-Burton Law, which actually the U.S. just reinstated earlier this year. This Helms-Burton Law is really, really nasty. What it does is it tells countries all around the world that we will not trade with you if you trade with Cuba. We will have sanctions against you if you trade with Cuba. That is inhumane. That's an act of war against Cuba. It's so terrifyingly disgusting. And even like with when the Cubans threw out the Spanish colonialism in 1898, the U.S. jumped in right away and passed the law that gave them the right to Guantanamo Bay. So even though the Cubans were still struggling in their land, the U.S. had a military base since the 1898, soon after that, and it was supposed to be a 100-year treaty where the U.S. had agreed that they would give up Guantanamo after 100 years. So in 1998, the 100th anniversary, the Cubans they demanded the U.S. move out. They said, okay, this is the treaty that you signed, and of course we know the U.S. history on treaties, you know? The U.S. obviously refused. Guantanamo base is still there, just as a thorn in their side. And so part of the Venceremos Brigade contingent went to Guantanamo this year. And it's still a battle. Even like U.S. farmers are against the blockade because the U.S. farmers could sell hundreds and hundreds of $1 million worth of produce to Cuba, which needs it desperately, because for them to get produce from Europe or China or any other place, the transportation costs are excessive. So they want produce that's much closer nearby, obviously.
These are really important points to make up, and not just to, and I think this is important to just think about how this is affecting the U.S. as well, because food produced in the United States, I think 1/3 of all the food produced gets thrown in the garbage, if you think about it. And when I was in Venezuela, because of the sanctions, we're starting getting lightheaded because there was no gluten in anything. And they're asserting, what they're trying to build is food sovereignty, and not just this kind of like hypothetical, go back to the earth kind of thing. It's a survival thing, and the special period that Cuba underwent as well. And I think even thinking about the oil that fuels the generators, the carbon, even the minimal amount of carbon consumption that's there, it speaks to even things like the Green New Deal, and how the Green New Deal ignores the fact that the United States is not only preventing the consumption, the low consumption, extremely low consumption when you look at the United States, of these countries and fossil fuel consumption, and then also withholding the green technology that would be available to them otherwise. And we can talk about the lithium mines in Bolivia, which is another story. But I want to kind of wrap up because we don't have very much time. Why is it important to learn from and act in solidarity with Cuba, but then also maybe give some closing thoughts on how people can join the Venceremos Brigade? Did I get it right? My Spanish is not. I'll just be like, whatever, green go. Green gas, because it's intersectional. Anyways, so why is it important to learn from and act in solidarity with Cuba? But any last thoughts on how people can join?
Just one thought on what our panel was talking about, the elections, about the claims that Cuba is a dictatorship and all this kind of stuff. It is it's democracy that the United States has never seen. When people run for offices in Cuba, whether it's in the National Assembly or in the CDRs, the Committees for the Defense of the Revolution, the local, the municipal, the provinces, you don't have to spend $1 million, you don't have to spend $100,000, you don't have to spend $10 to win these elections. You go door to door, you talk to folks at your community centers, you put up your flyers that tell us what you want to do to help your community, and that's how people are elected. Fidel Castro was elected every single time he was elected. And of course, he generally won with 90-95% of the vote because he was so popular. He was on the Grama boat that came in 1953 to start the revolution in Cuba, and people know that. They know the important role he has played in holding that country, the revolution together. So he is obviously extremely popular, and that's why he won. But the students, the young people, they belong to the pioneros, the young pioneers, and they sit at all the electoral boxes to be sure that nobody's cheating, throwing in 5 or 6 votes. But it's a pure democracy. Like I said, it doesn't cost you anything to run for offices at the highest levels. So just wanted to dispel that myth about it being a dictatorship or non-democratic, whatever.
Thank you.
And in terms of, talk about the first.
Oh, okay. Can I just say one thing about food sovereignty first? Okay, think about it. Where does, and this is what something that just totally fascinated me about Cuba was that 80% of the produce that's grown in Cuba, 80% of all the produce that they have in Cuba is grown on Cuba. Therefore, it's organic. So the country is eating just super duper healthy. I can tell you when I came back here and I was like, yeah, Dion's, and I was like, oh my god, I was so sick. I was so sick because I was eating so good over there. But food sovereignty, and it makes me, because this is my field, it makes me think about water. Where does all the water go? It goes to big ag, right? And to me, when you're talking about water, there's we live in the Southwest, we have such a scarcity of water, but there have been generations and generations of people that have thrived in this area because we knew how to manage water correctly. And therefore, if we know how to manage water correctly, then we should only be growing food for our own consumptive needs, right? And so I just wanted to add that because it was just got me thinking about water and everything like that. But just what I learned from Cuba is that the revolution is possible and it is obtainable and it's there. And one thing that me and Sheldon have talked about many times over again is that we have a revolution to continue ourselves, and that's our Pueblo Revolt. That's the 1680 Pueblo Revolt revolution that never died. It's never died, and we shouldn't talk about 1680 as a date. We should talk about the 1680 as the start of a revolution that we should be continuing on a day-to-day basis. And one thing that was really beautiful about being in Cuba was that the ECAP people, compañeros, were so excited to learn about the first revolution in the United States, which is us, Pueblo people, you know? And so going forward, I know myself, next time I go to Cuba, I'm going to ask more and more questions about their water strategies, water management strategies, and you know, more in terms of like their agriculture and things, and energy as well. And what types of other policies or regulations they're putting in to reduce carbon footprints and reduce, like, you know, their probably extremely low emissions. And that's another thing about the Green New Deal is it doesn't acknowledge that the communities that are going to be impacted the most by climate change are the ones that are contributing the least to it. So with that, go and I know next year, like, I will bring just so many more resources to share because it's a political educational exchange, right? We should be bringing resources, things like books and other types of literature to the Cuban people so that way they can have access. Like, we're the access that they have to our types of resources. So, you know, that reciprocity should continue. And for next year, I know that this delegation just came to fruition, like, very organically. But this next coming year, we're going to work really hard to have a more, like a stronger presence of Indigenous and African people. So please talk to us, tell us how to get involved, and, you know, we will work more collectively on fundraising to make sure that we can get, like, revolutionary minds to this brigade for the VB 51.
I'll be super brief. I know we don't have a lot of time. A lot of what I was doing in Cuba, what I was learning about Cuba's history, everything ongoing right now, it just reminded me, like, again, how Julia was saying, you know, they were quick to tell us that, you know, our revolution is possible, that we can win, that we will see victory, and that we shouldn't lose sight of that. You know, that was huge. You know, for a long time, I never even thought of 1680 as a revolution. You know, we don't talk about it as much as we should be doing. You know, we think about it as a date, and then we talk about it for maybe a couple of days before August 10th comes up, and then it goes away. You know, and we should be thinking about that every day, like it is in Cuba. You know, we talk about the revolution and defending the revolution, and then a revolution not just about fighting. You know, I think over here, sometimes we have this misconception of thinking when we hear revolution, we think, oh yeah, we want to fight, we want to battle, we want to go to these, you know, many fronts and these battles and these wars, when it's like, no, revolution, the way I understand it now, and I'm able to come to light to, is a deep love for the land, for humanity, for your relatives, for your people, for your ways, your traditions, your cultures, and everything that you're taught, and everything that you want to believe in and stand up for. And a lot of it is, you know, believing in self-determination, and the rights to your land, and the rights to go gather in your land, in your territory. You know, and a lot of that we struggle through that here. You know, different policies or different borders, or quote unquote fake borders. You know, and you know we think that, you know, that's how do we end the blockade? You know, we exchange that information, we exchange that knowledge, we go, we visit, we sit, we talk, we build, and we continue that. The same way we can continue 1680 revolt, the revolution that has never ended. You know, we continue that today, tomorrow, next week, next month. You know, every single day. To me, you know, that's something I was able to just learn and be in and sit with, and then be reminded of it, you know, every day after that.
So yeah, I think it's important to learn from Cuba, because Cuba is from the future. Cuba is an example of a radically different way of organizing a society. a way of organizing a society in which you put life first, and not just like human life, but like all Earth life first, and you organize around that principle, and you make sure that people's needs are met, and that the land is taken care of, and that the water is clean, and that if a hurricane is coming, that the people's homes are not destroyed. Like, you organize in such a way that people's needs are met, and then you build a society from the ground up. And that is what we are trying to do. Like, if you are a revolutionary socialist, if you are a communist, if you are an anarchist, you are fundamentally trying to create a way of living that is about centering life and centering the future and respecting the past rather than what we have now, where a few people at the top get all the wealth and all the access, and those at the bottom have to suffer, and if we can't work, then we die. Cuba is from the future. Cuba is what we want to see. Cuba is an example to learn from, not just in terms of like revolutionary politics, but also in terms of like living sustainably. Like, the lifestyle that people have in the United States is not sustainable. The amount of driving, the amount of like waste, the amount of food that's wasted, the amount of like resources that are wasted is not sustainable. And it's a lifestyle that's built on the exploitation of Africa, the exploitation of Central and South America, the exploitation of the Caribbean and Asia. It's a lifestyle that's built on millions of corpses and destroyed land masses. So it's not sustainable. It cannot continue if we want humanity to continue. And so Cuba is an example of how to live in such a way where people's needs are still met, where they're still happy, they're still able to like grow and advance, but it's not leaching from the earth. So having that example there to learn from is something, particularly us as like colonized people, as African and indigenous people, is extremely important. That we look at what they've done, that we look at where they succeeded, and also at the mistakes they've made, because we've been up here, saying good things about Cuba because we love it, because it gave us a lot, but we're not pretending that Cuba's perfect. Cuba's made mistakes. Cuba's the first to admit that. And so we see what they did wrong, and we see what they did right, and we learn from it, and we build upon it. It's extremely important. And the reason that we should act in solidarity is because, as I said in the video, we are citizens of an empire. We are citizens of the largest and most destructive empire that's ever existed. An empire that has destroyed struggles of oppressed peoples all over the world for no other reason but then to consolidate power. That's what happened in Bolivia. In Bolivia, indigenous people collectivized and organized and fought a revolution and put someone in place that represented them. And the United States was like, we're gonna ruin it. Just because they can, just because they want to maintain control. And so as citizens of a country that does that everywhere, as citizens of a country who believe in justice, we have a responsibility in the belly of the beast to fight back and to stop that. We are in the position to stop this empire from destroying struggles, and we have a responsibility to do that. And if we don't, the rest of the world has the right to turn on us. But we want to encourage you to join the 51st Venceremos Brigade. Like Julia said, we want to make it even more indigenous, even more African. We want to bring our people, we want to bring Chicano folks. And our folks don't have money, and it's a really expensive trip. And so we are going to be fundraising throughout the year. And so even if you are not up to travel, you can still support in that way. But we want to bring a huge New Mexico contingent next year. We want people representing, and we want the people who need to learn from Cuba's example to be in Cuba next year. So please consider donating to support the 51st Brigade, or joining the 51st Brigade, and also follow us on Facebook. We are the New Mexico Venceremos Brigade Committee. Thank you.
Making messages too.
And they can messages? On the Facebook page. Oh yeah, messages on the Facebook page. Thanks.
Can I see in hindsight, we didn't give you, our friends, time to ask questions. So what I suggest is, once we finish here, we're going to go eat, and during the dinner, let's do some group questions or individually, whatever you want, but any kind of questions you have about our trip.
Asking you questions in front of the whole group, so we wouldn't have to repeat it in a small area, and so that we could share it.
Yeah, let's do that. Yeah, good idea.
So we can time it. I mean, I'll set my clock. So
Be fast if you could wait.
Great idea.
3 questions, is that okay?
Thank you, God. Congratulations to you all. It's been very inspiring seeing these young people go. And thank you, Roberto. Roberto, it was organic, but Roberto struggled for many, many months to organize y'all going. So, I mean, I'm just really thankful for this. It's been inspiring for me. I've been lucky enough to go twice. My question is, what were their questions of you?
Let's take like 2 more questions as well.
We'll answer them all.
Okay, a la vez, I mean, at the same time, you're gonna take the 3 questions together?
Yeah. Okay.
Anybody else?
So what were
No, I'm not going. My questions are too detailed.
If we as sovereign nations, considering us as tribal members, indigenous folk, is there any way that we could use our sovereignty to, of course, help Cuba in their revolution? Any other questions?
I'll just speak up. Could you talk about, I understand there are a lot of travel restrictions in place. What was it like traveling? Were you hassled? Can you talk a little about your experience traveling?
I'll answer real quick the last question the brother just made. Over the years, the last 40 years, the brigade has never gone under a license by the U.S. government. But this year, because we wanted to send the largest delegation we've ever sent to send 180 people, it was a logistical nightmare. We're going to have to send people out of Montreal or Mexico City or something like that. So in talking with the Cubans, we decided that we would go with a license this year. We haven't made a decision about next year. I personally think that it's unlikely that we're going to get a license because we've always stood up against blockade. So we were basically breaking the law by going to Cuba without a license. Every time we left the Albuquerque International Airport, we had a press conference that said, we're going to Cuba, we do not have a license, come and get us. So that license issue has been real key for us, and we'll just see what happens for next year. Did that answer the question?
Thank you.
I'll answer the sovereignty question. Yes, I just short answer. There is a way that we can use our sovereignty. I think that's just a whole another struggle in this land base just to begin with. Indigenous nations exercising true sovereignty to better our communities. I think it's, and you know, this is something that I've been really thinking about more and more is if there is and when the possibility arises to build solidarity, have nation-to-nation solidarity with indigenous sovereign nations and the sovereign nation of Cuba, I feel like that would just like be a way to end the blockade. You know, as you know, myself and Sheldon and Nick and other of the revolutionary minds in this room that do focus on indigenous sovereignty and indigenous liberation, exercising our sovereignty in the most strategic way is going to liberate our people. And you know, we've seen examples of resistance in the global south many times, not just in Bolivia, but also in Chile, in Mexico, and you know, there is like the spirit of resistance, the indigenous spirit of resistance in those communities. How do we exercise sovereignty? Well, we're gonna have to start figuring out more radical types of strategies to address our sovereignty, exercise it strategically, and you know, I can't wait till that starts happening, you know? And so there's actually a really beautiful example that Oni had shared with us was the Muscogee Seminole Nation of Florida. They actually built nation-to-nation solidarity with Cuba while Fidel Castro was in office, and he even said, you know what, if they don't want you guys there, you can come to Cuba and stay with us, you know? And they're like, you know, we're compañeros, you know, we're comrades now. And so, you know, Cuba has a long history of building solidarity. Even one of the president of ECAP, she was like, you know, I remember Fidel Castro was alive. Oh my gosh, Leonard Peltier here had sent a spiritual leader and like put all this smoke around him, and he was just sure loving it and let him do it, you know. And so, you know, like they were like, he was like blessing him and things like that. So, you know, this nation-to-nation solidarity, and again, to repeat, Cubans' ideology of liberation is if you're not free, then none of us are free.
Yeah, questions that they asked of us. There was a night there, we were able to organize amongst ourselves, our committee and the different groups there, especially with ECAP there. And we kind of had, you know, a sit down in a literal, like, nation-to-nation knowledge sharing, and we were able to talk about different things that we face in indigenous folks where we're at, and being able to just share, like, how it is for us too, and what we go through, strategies that we're using, different things that we face, things that have been implemented, things we're learning from as well, things that we're trying to build as well. It was a huge, like, I don't know, 2-3 hours of just sharing and talking and building, and literally, again, like, yeah, I don't know, that's all questions that they asked us was like, they wanted to hear about 680 Public Revolt, they wanted to hear about San Diego, they wanted to hear about Cuba, they wanted to hear about how we engage with our different like policies or different off track train of thought, but like legislation or things being passed or, you know, things I don't know, proposed and things of that sort. We were able to just like sit and literally have conversations about it and talk, and it was amazing. Like 2-3 hours of this, and we were just sharing, going back and forth and talking about solidarity, what that means, what it looks like, what it can look like, and how it can be built. Just different things.
Yeah, in terms of what questions Cuban folks asked us, so there was like a lot of like genuine concern for our comfort. They were all like, is this food good? Like, where are you sleeping? Like, how's the bed? Like, they were very, very concerned about us, and they looked out for us. There was like a lot of like, how you doing questions. But then also, I'm a revolutionary Pan-Africanist. That means I'm in a revolutionary Pan-African party. We're trying to organize the African diaspora to free Africa and our people. And so whenever I go to a place, even if it's the United States or if it's in Central and South America, I always like try to find the African people, because we have a particular connection that's like always there across context, but also because I want to know what it's like what our experiences are like in particular contexts. And before I had gone to Cuba, people, Europeans, told me that Cuba was really racist. And so I was like, all right, compared to the United States. I went, and my experience was like, I feel really like free here. I feel like no one's like looking at me weird. I feel like I can wear what I want and like talk to who I want and like go where I want, and like no one's gonna arrest me or harass me. But I know that I'm a visitor here, so I wanted to like talk to African people in Cuba. So I was just like, what is your experience? What is it like for you? Is it racist? And for the most part, they were like, you know, there's like still like discrimination, but I can do what I want. I can like work where I want, I can live where I want, my needs are met. If a person is racist, I can just be like, peace, and not have to deal with them. And so their experience with racism in Cuba was like that it still exists, but that it doesn't have such like an overall encompassing impact on their life. It's not institutional, it's not exactly, it's not systemic, it's interpersonal. It's very, very different. And then they also asked about like the African struggle in the United States, and about Pan-Africanism. Like the AFP has had a presence on many different brigades, including the Venceremos Brigade, but also the May Day Brigade. So like some of they like knew of us because we kind of stand out. And so they were just asking about Pan-African politics and about the African liberation struggle in the United States. And we had deep conversations about Cuba's internationalism in Africa, and also about the struggle of Africans in the United States and how we should frame it and the strategies that have worked and the heroes. So it was just a common exchange and a sense of connection that's like always there whenever I encounter African people. And then in terms of travel, Roberto really answered like our experience was licensed, and so I remember when we were coming back and we had to go through customs, we were like, uh-oh, like the searches, but it was fine, like he had like 7 miles around, they didn't care. So yeah, we like got through without problems, but I anticipate next year is probably gonna be more complicated, particularly after the Obama administration rules are rescinded completely, so we'll see how it goes. But I would say if you're interested in going to Cuba, and I think that everybody should have the opportunity to see a place where the people run and they are building a radically different a way of living. And I would say like come on a political trip. Like don't go and like sleep on the beach. Like the beaches are lit, it's like beautiful. comfortable, but like the point of going there is to learn. It's to see a different way to live. And so join the Venceremos Brigade, join the May Day Brigade, or join like the National Network on Cuba, like they have trips like every couple of months. But see if you can go with an organization that's committed to Cuba solidarity work so you can see the full picture and not just the beaches.
Between you and your food, but I do want to answer your question to think beyond just Cuba, and to think that building alternative relations with other nations and oppressed nations, right, is important. I was in Palestine, and Palestinians are like, why would you support Palestinian liberation? Like, Palestine doesn't offer anything for native nations. And he's like, you people are at the bottom of the barrel when it comes to oppressed people in the United States. Nobody cares about American Indians. Why are you coming here and want to be radical, solidarity and all this? What do you have to offer Palestine? And it's a good question. What do we have to offer Cuba? We don't have any power in this country. And it's because what's on offer right now for native nations? Militarism, war, military contracts. The alternative to that kind of nationhood is a white supremacist nationhood that our nations are currently participating in and building and constructing and actively constructing. So I think it's important to have our nations begin, and I've been talking to our treaty councils about this, condemning US sanctions against Venezuela, the blockade against Cuba, but not only doing that, but inviting people like Omar Brigade, who was banned from the United States, into our homelands as an international guest, inviting Evo Morales as an international guest to our homelands because we are sovereign nations. That's what sovereign nations do. And so I think that's important. This country doesn't have the right to say who belongs and who doesn't belong. And so it's important to stand up against Homeland Security and to not just call for the abolition of ICE, but to actually kick these guys, these occupiers off our land, and to end these institutions. And educate our leaders. And I need to talk to Julie about some things, but but I think that's something to think about, not just Cuba, but thinking about all of these other struggles and how they're connected as well.
Thank you.
So if you are hungry, there's food now. Woo! So if you go out the door and take a right, there will see tables and there's food waiting.
Yeah.